I don't think there's any Palestinian or Palestinian household that hasn't experienced trauma because of living under Israeli occupation and apartheid. Going through military checkpoints on a regular basis is just part of our life. There's an Israeli military checkpoint between every city and village and every village and village in Palestine. Being waken up in the middle of the night by completely and fully armed military soldiers with M16s and machine guns pointed at you while you're in your bed, taking your mom or your dad to prison. That was part of my everyday life in Palestine. We always knew it was violence. We always knew it was military occupation. We've always, longed for liberation and freedom, but didn't really understand what freedom meant. My dad's never left Palestine in his life because he was a political prisoner for many years, and as part of a collective punishment, Israel doesn't allow him to travel, and that's a punishment that many Palestinians face. So he's one of those people. He's never left Palestine. I think he thought I would have a better quality of life in Canada. He kept going on and on about the welfare state and the healthcare system and all of that kind of stuff. The aspects in Canada that now we're fighting to make better or keep even, that are under threat. So from his perspective, first of all, for both my parents to send a 17-year-old by myself to go for 2 years to live somewhere else that we have zero connection to. And they are not allowed to travel, so they can't hop on a plane and come visit me, is a very challenging thing. Mm-hmm. But they really wanted me to go at the time because it was during the second Intifada in Palestine. And most of the time, my city and other cities in the West Bank were under complete military invasion by the Israelis. We used to actually I used to climb behind walls and through the backyard to get to school because there would be soldiers on the street. So we would sneak in to get to school safely. So they wanted me to have a safer, better way to receive my education. Okay. And Canada was the acceptable place for them.
So for your parents, it was more about what they perceived to be a safe place, and they saw Canada to be that. I do agree Canada is a great place to be. So, props to mom and dad. You mentioned a few things, and the question I was asking was about how is it like to live under an occupation? And you already touched on it as a collective punishment for people who are in prison. They cannot travel. Yeah. Can you tell us a little more about your experiences living in Palestine?
Right. So usually when I get this question, or at least when I first moved here, it was a confusing question because that's the only life I knew. So when people told me, tell us how it's like to live in Palestine, it's the only thing I knew. And for me, it was normal. So again, things like going through military checkpoints on a regular basis is just part of our life, right? That's something that we do. There's an Israeli military checkpoint between every city and village and every village and village in Palestine. You can't drive for more than 40 minutes in a car without being stopped and asked.
What exactly is a checkpoint?
A checkpoint basically is a military kind of temporary or permanent base for Israeli soldiers who are fully armed to stop Palestinian cars or pedestrians, check for their IDs, and many times they would arrest people at checkpoints, right? The whole purpose of them, Israel justifies it as a security measure. I'm not sure security for whom, but the only thing that checkpoints do is to just keep Palestinians under complete military control. And to continue with their apartheid policies and to keep us fragmented from each other.
Okay, and so that's a way for them to have a control and continue to oppress the Palestinians. Yeah. I want to know, is this the same, does this rule apply to Israelis? Do they have checkpoints as well?
No.
So it's just for Palestinians?
Yes.
Okay. I wonder why people still do not consider this an apartheid.
Yeah, and I mean, now it's much, much harder for people to reject the idea, or not the idea, the fact that the Israeli regime as it exists today is an apartheid regime. And when we talk about it this way, that's exactly it. Your question does this apply to everybody or just Palestinians? This is a very simple yet accurate way to describe apartheid. It's a legal system where the practices of that system apply to certain people and not others based on their race, religion, nationality, etc. So it's rooted in racism. It's rooted in discrimination. And checkpoints is just one example that actually demonstrates that apartheid does exist and it is apartheid.
And I like how you just said it's one example of many examples. And as a Palestinian growing up there, having parents who are activists and advocates for liberation, I want to know more about the trauma as a young Palestinian, a girl, seeing all of this growing up.
Yeah. I don't think there's any Palestinian or Palestinian household that hasn't experienced trauma because of living under Israeli occupation and apartheid. And by that, I also include Palestinians who live in Israel proper, who are Israeli citizens, and that 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinians who still live in the so-called Israel proper, or we call it the 48 areas. So Yafa, for example, the city that I'm named after, is in 48. I'm not allowed to go to Yafa. My name is Yafa, but because I carry a West Bank ID, a green ID, I'm not allowed. Israel doesn't allow me to go to Jerusalem or to Yafa and what have you. So basically, when I say trauma applies to everybody, it applies to also Palestinians, not just in the West Bank or Gaza, but also to Palestinians in the diaspora. Palestinian refugees, Palestinians who were born to parents who come from the diaspora and never been to Palestine.
Absolutely, because you see it in survivor's guilt.
Absolutely.
Them trying to help. And even when it comes to social media, like I remember even just seeing what the events that happened in May of 2021, where people were going to IG Live on a lot of content creators, and they're actually seeing the explosions happen, and they're having secondary trauma from those experiences. Yeah. So it's definitely something that affects not just the people there. Obviously, it affects them in a higher proportion, and there's no question about that. But everyone is affected at the end of the day.
Absolutely, and this is what is referred to as intergenerational trauma. So similar to the indigenous people in Canada, who you have a lot of indigenous people who didn't go to residential schools, for example, but they still experience the intergenerational trauma that their ancestors and grandparents and parents have gone through. So trauma is born, can be born and also experienced firsthand or passed down through intergenerational trauma. And, for us dealing in Palestine, again, this is the only thing that I knew prior to coming here. So having to stop for checkpoints and improve my ID was a normal, or is still, a normalized act, even though nothing about it is normal. Being waken up in the middle of the night by a bunch of completely and fully armed military soldiers with M16s and machine guns pointed at you while you're in your bed, taking your mom or your dad to prison. That was part of my everyday life in Palestine. So I didn't know anything about it. I didn't even know it was trauma until I came to Canada. And I remember one of my first shocks was, first of all, the massive amount of space there is in Canada.
In Canada. I was going to ask you what surprised you about it when you came here.
Secondly, the first time I ever crossed by land in a car, one province to the next, I believe we were driving from Alberta to Saskatchewan. And my previous partner at the time was driving, and he goes, Yafa, we're about to enter Saskatchewan, And I reached to get my passport. And he looks at me and he says, what are you doing? And I said, oh, isn't there a checkpoint? So, that was one of the I think for him too, one of the most fundamental examples of, because he was shocked too that I thought that I was expecting to face a checkpoint just because we're entering a new province. So, this is slowly when you start being in another place like here or anywhere else in the world that's not under military occupation. Then I started, realizing, wow, like nothing about the life that we live. And I mean, we always knew it was violence. We always knew it was military occupation. We've always, longed for liberation and freedom, but didn't really understand what freedom meant, really what freedom is, until I experienced it here.
I love that. I love the fact that you have one experience and one lived experience. And when you came here and you thought it was normal when you were back in Palestine, and then you came here, you realize, no, that's not okay. And I think if people start kind of like looking at it and empathizing the way that, let's imagine like let's say Canada is Israel, right? And we cannot go to a single place without our passports, or we're going to have some random people, or not random, the military come in and knock on our doors in the middle of the night, when we have that fear that our family might go to jail every single day, when we see people lose their lives in front of us, then we can start to empathize that this is not okay. Just because we're in one part of the world versus another, it doesn't justify anything.
And if you look at history, the very similar stuff has happened in previous apartheid regimes. Like if you look at South Africa, Black South Africans during South African apartheid, there were many areas that were restricted from entering, and they had to show passes, right? So after certain hours, if the apartheid police stops them or military persons stop them, they have to show a pass, they have to show a permit that they're allowed to be in that place at that time. And if not, they will be punished, right? So if you look at the situation in Palestine, it's the exact same. Even our IDs are different colors, representing which geographic location you come from. And if this is not legal discrimination, I'm not really sure what is. And about the normalization, Hani, just quickly, you just reminded me of a story about my sister when she was really, really young. She actually believed, because she was crying one day and she went to my mom and she said, I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to go to prison. And my mom said, why do you keep thinking that you're going to prison? And she actually believed that it was going to prison. It was a rite of passage everybody has to go through at some point when they become an adult.
That's wild. Like to think that a child will think that's normal, and it's like you said, a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show the trauma that we face, or the Palestinians face, back under the occupation and apartheid.